Here's a funny quote.
Hit me.
A communist must never be opinionated or domineering, thinking that he is good in everything while others are good in nothing. He must never shut himself up in his little room or brag and boast and lord it over others.
Yo, what up? It's Left Unread, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. My name is Will.
My name is Aaron.
This is Left Unread, a podcast where two dudes engage in a radical self-education.
That's right. And this episode we are reading Quotations from Chairman Mao Zedong.
Right. Quotations from Chairman, the great helmsman himself, Mao Zedong. Don't really know that much about him, except he was part of the Chinese Communist Party. He was their leader on the Long March, one of the greatest strategic military retreats in history. They marched all the communists a fucking billion miles up to the Yunnan province. Then they did a Chinese United Front to fight the Japanese imperialists. Afterwards, Chiang Kai-shek said, "I've had enough communism," so they fought a civil war. And they won. In 1949, the people stood up. Mao Zedong was the Secretary General, who knows, of the Chinese Communist Party up until his death, 1976. He was a real-ass motherfucker.
Yes, indeed. And Quotations, what we read for this episode is just a selection of quotations from many of the writings, and even there's quite a few speeches and stuff here that Mao gave. So it kind of works as a summary of his political ideology, which I think serves as a good introduction, but it is definitely a very surface level introduction.
Yeah, we were looking on, the question was hard for us to decide what to read first when it comes to Mao. I mean, this was literally like published as a pocketbook, you know, what does Mao think about this or that? I can just crack open my book to the section on women or whatever. And now I know.
Now you know.
You know, it's a little pocket reader. What would Jesus do? What would the great helmsman do? Our Chairman Mao himself. In fact, it was published in that style, a small leather-bound red book, the little red book, that people would keep in their pockets, and then they could consult it whenever they needed to understand what the great chairman had to say about unity with the bourgeois or something.
Yeah. And quick shout out at the beginning to One Dime and his video on the Cultural Revolution. Very good video.
Yeah. Really cool, especially if the only thing you know about the Cultural Revolution is coming from what you remember from high school. Throw that out the window. Go watch One Dime's video. It was really good.
Yep. And it's cool. I didn't mention this before, but he has different people reading different quotes, and you might catch all of the different people that you recognize. Marcus Paul was in there.
Marcus Paul was in there.
From
the Deprogram. Yeah, the Deprogram guys were all in there.
FD Signifier was in there. Yeah.
Really cool stuff.
Cool dudes.
Cool stuff.
Yeah, and as a person who did not have much / any exposure to Mao, I was really interested to get into this. I've been kind of champing at the bit to read some Mao and kind of dig into it a little bit. And I would say I was overall very pleasantly surprised with his strict adherence to the people.
Yes, he's a big understander. He's a big communism understander. Now, Mao is very clear that the power of the party and the power of the movement ultimately comes from the people. And without having the basis of the people there's nothing you can really get done. And he makes that clear. Okay, and I think the main thing he talks about having to do with that is probably the mass line.
Yeah, there's a whole section in this about the mass line wherein he writes, 24 years of experience tell us that the right task, policy, and style of work invariably conform with the demands of the masses at a given time and place and invariably strengthen our ties with the masses. And the wrong task, policy, and style of work invariably disagree with the demands of the masses at a given time and place and invariably alienate us from the masses. The reason why such evils as dogmatism, empiricism, commandism, tailism, sectarianism, bureaucracy, and an arrogant attitude in work are definitely harmful and intolerable, and why anyone suffering from these maladies must overcome them, is that they alienate us from the masses. He is for the people, by the people, and frankly, of all of the communists whose work we've read so far, I feel like has been the most principled in maintaining that connection to the people throughout his entire life.
Yeah, Phil is very silly to say, but he really is a communist.
As an extension of that, and this idea of the mass line, is the idea that, you know, it's very easy, and I think if we look back historically on socialist projects of the past, party leaders have a tendency to become alienated from the people, or it's very easy for that to happen, at least. Mao was very much against that, and he built the idea of the mass line as a way of deliberately trying to make sure that the party did not become alienated by literally having the party leaders go and be of the people, work alongside the people, so they would never lose that connection and would always be very closely tied. He also wrote in Get Organized, apparently in November of 1943, "We communists must be able to integrate ourselves with the masses in all things. If our party members spend their whole lives sitting indoors and never go out to face the world and brave the storm, what good will they be to the people? None at all.
Yeah.
And we do not need such people as party members."
Yeah. One thing that Mao's really clear about is that this whole shebang is going to require struggle. It's going to require active work. It's going to require a bunch of self-criticism. It's going to require working of your own line via practice among the people, right? He's saying that, like, we can make policy all day, but that policy isn't going to matter until we apply it, until we understand what worked and what didn't work about it, and then we rectify it. Okay. And I think that that's just a really strong message, especially because, I mean, it's not that we've been waffling about, but we've been reading just a lot of theory, and I've been a little bit, I've felt a need for a bit more of the brass tacks, like I wanted a bit more of like the fundamentals. And I think in this primer, at least, or in this book, Mao puts out a lot of very fundamental ideas in like essentially bullet points, in ways that can be followed by a party organization, like rules or steps that you might expect in like a party program or something along those lines.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting about this work is that he does kind of toe the line with doing both of those things, or he balances it quite well, where he hits you with the theory or the ideology behind the practice, but then also there are a number of points where he will, like you said, give you a bulleted list of here's the actionable stuff to actually do to build the party. And I found that very refreshing.
Yeah, especially because if the goal is for this to be like a mass movement, right, then we need messages that are going to reach people and are also going to be legible to people. People need to read them and understand them, especially if we want them to act on those ideas. I've had some contention in the past with slogans, who cares about a slogan, but ultimately, if the power comes from the people, then we need the people to understand our message, right?
We communists are like seeds, and the people are like the soil. Wherever we go, we must unite with the people, take root, and blossom among them.
Yes. Serve the people. He truly is about that. And I think he's acutely aware of the size of the problem that they're going to have to deal with. I mean, he says very clearly, China is a big country with 600 million people in it, right? I mean, it's more so now, obviously, but like he has to really reckon with that. I think there's something to be said about the historical context in which this is written. That's a little misleading because this is a quote book, but there is an expanse of quotes in this book from a lot of different times. I mean, you've got quotes from like the 20s all the way up until like the 60s, So I don't necessarily think it's so apparent to see Mao's progression in here, but you can definitely tell the difference in, like pre-Chinese Civil War and post. Like when he's fighting the Japanese, he's talking in a very specific way about unity, coalition, right? That kind of action, because it's serving a particular purpose, the defense of China versus the Japanese. He was collaborating with the Kuomintang at the time, and only afterwards did his stance kind of change a little bit. You can see that in the quotes here. Mao Zedong thought, it's seen as a progression of Marxism. So, if we're holding Marxism to be this progressive science, one that's built based off of practice, then this is the newest practical form of Marxism. So it's important to study. But man, what the fuck? I was just thinking about the history of China, just what you had said earlier, where Mao makes a lot of speculation about what the future of China looks like. And he even says that, it could be decades or a few decades before China has taken up a revisionist line, has taken up a totally different character. And that's something that is on my mind a lot, simply because we still deal with China today. Is it still right to consider it as a socialist project?
That's actually one of the things that I wrote in the front of my book here that I wanted to talk about. I was calling it the TikTok take.
Yeah, the TikTok take.
But I found myself wrapped up in the communist side of TikTok lately. And I saw someone leave a comment that said, when we talk about China, it's communist when what we're saying is good, and it's capitalist when what we're saying is bad.
Yeah.
And I think that that's obviously not a take that's given in good faith.
Yes.
But I do think that there is some truth to it. And I think it's an interesting kind of gateway into talking about criticism and self-criticism. And I don't know, I'm just curious on your thoughts on that. I have a couple of quotes related to that I would point to from the text.
Yeah, it's tough to say. So I honestly don't know, right? Deng Xiaoping says that if a market serves socialism, then it's a socialist market. And at the core, I don't know if I agree. Because I think that there's something inherent in a market that prevents it from being equitable, that prevents it from... I don't know. That's the problem, is that I feel that a market is a capitalist feature. It's not something that can be socialist, I also feel that China is a capitalist country in the sense that the means of production are still owned mostly by individuals, right?
Industrialists.
Yeah. I don't actually know enough about the Chinese economy to say that they have like socialized industry. I'm sure they have a bunch of nationalized industry, but I know that they still have capitalists. The selling point of China in my mind is the fact that the capitalists are more or less subservient to the Chinese Communist Party, and that's a big deal. Right? Their capitalists are under the threat of death if they fuck up, which is a good thing, if you ask me. Our capitalists don't do that, right? They get a $200,000 fine for funding death squads in Colombia. It's like, who gives a shit,
Well, yeah, I think here in the West, the inverse is true, where Congress answers to the capitalists, so the state answers to the capitalists, where I think in China, the inverse is true.
And the thing is that, again, this is just something that we don't know enough about to talk about like confidently, but is the Chinese Communist Party still a communist party? Like, I don't even know how much Marx they've studied. Do they get a primer? Do they do like, they don't do struggle sessions. Like, it's very weird to think of the Maoism in practice in this book versus the giant of the Chinese Communist Party today.
Yeah.
Like the huge bureaucratic beast that we think of when we think of the Chinese Communist Party versus like this idea of like ragtag Maoist rebels in the mountains here. That's an odd thing to think about in my mind. And I think that a big part of that is just the development of actually existing socialism. It has its own hurdles. It has its own problems. And I think that what we see and saw throughout history, even taking out the influence of the Western world, is the fact that they had to deal with a lot of their own things, such as like this bureaucratization of the party.
Yeah, even Mao will tell you that there are two types of contradictions that any socialist project is going to have to face. Those are the internal contradictions and the external. And obviously, there are many external forces that are at play when, and influencing what any socialist project has had to do historically to try to get by. But that doesn't negate the idea that there are still internal forces and contradictions within the project that need addressing.
Yeah, I love something he says here. I'm not going to try to find the quote, but he says, after the regular bullets stop working, after we have won the war, then the enemy will use sugar-coated bullets instead. It's like there will still be challenges internally. I mean, there will still be capitalists internally. There will still people that want it. The way that Mao talked about it is that they were taking the capitalist road, right? The capitalist road to development, where they wanted to bring capitalism back to China. And again, I don't know how socialism developed in China. How truly did the means of production, how were they given to the people? I mean, if I want to talk about at a fundamental level, if a country is socialist or not, what qualifies that in my mind? The biggest thing to me would be the socialized ownership of the means of production.
Yep.
Do I know enough to say what that exactly looks like? I don't know. I don't even know if it's like I know it when I see it kind of thing. You know what I mean? If the people run the state and the state owns the means, does that mean the people own the means? I'm not sure.
Yeah, the intermediary there makes it a little uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I think that this is one of the great challenges of doing this study that I've found anyway, is knowing that communism as a project has stages.
Yeah.
And at what point does it shift from being a transitional state to a communist state? You know what I mean? And like you said, what are the features that demarcate that shift? And what little I know says that there has to be some form of capitalist development before a socialist program can begin, because you need that industry to be developed to a certain point in order to turn over the means of production,
right?
In order for them to be seized.
Yeah. That's what Marx says too.
Yeah, that's so. it's weird. Like you, I don't know much about the history of China in any context. I don't know much about the history of China, period. But like, what does the development of socialism look like in China? And was it fair to call it a socialist project? Is it still fair to call it a socialist project? I don't know the answer to that because it's so nebulous.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know.
That's a tough one. I mean, there's further study to be done there. You know, they dared to struggle. What came out on the other end after the fucking fight with the Western world is what we have today. Mm-hmm. Is it still socialist? I have no idea. The optimist in me says yes, right? The pessimist in me says no. That's it.
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
I think we have to think about these things in terms of degrees. It's not something that happens in absolutes.
Yeah. Also, the thing too is that if you have a socialist country but you're not building communism, like, is it still socialist?
What's the fucking point?
Yeah.
Would be my question.
Is it even socialist at all if you're not working towards that goal?
Yeah.
You know, and I think that developmentally, like, I don't know, once you get to a certain point, I don't know. It's fucking hard, man. Because I'm just thinking, like, the bureaucrats were content with having stable power, mm-hmm. right? How can you be in that position and still be working towards communism is the question. Like, what does that even look like? Say you, like, I don't know what the steps look like for building communism. You know, if our goal is to get to this higher phase, we do what? We use the state to transfer the control of the means of production to the working classes, to the masses. We create an apparatus that subjugates the minority to the majority, which then withers away. But then what? I mean, I don't know how you actually build communism after you've done that initial revolution, right? And I think maybe historically that's been the great challenge, is that they've lost sight of the ultimate goal because they don't know what it looks like, and they don't have a clue even how to take a step towards that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what little I do know about what happened in China, I think that is exactly what happened, is that there became a conflict around revisionism where they didn't know what was they had not clearly defined what it was supposed to look like, and so there became a point where there was dissent, and it was difficult for there to become this like party line.
Yeah,
where that's why the Cultural Revolution happened. It's because people were being accused of being revisionists, and it created a schism in the party. And the Red Army and the People's Liberation Army, no one was. They ended up going against one another.
Yeah, well, the Red Guards and the People's Liberation Army. There's something to be said about, this is a topic change, but another situation in which they had the army first, might I add. I think that's actually a really interesting point, is that the fundamental organization here came from the fact that they organized the army first. And not only that, but their army organization was one that was democratic. Even the last example where we saw this was the Paris Commune. That's the connection I made to my mind. But I think it's even more interesting for them to... Mao talks a lot about the construction of the military in a way that is equitable. You know, the officers and the soldiers...
Spends a long time on that. Yeah.
Well, he talks a lot about it because I think that's just like so much of what his organization has to do with, is the fact that they were literally building an army to fight the rest of China. You know, but like it says that officers can't beat soldiers, or like soldiers can speak openly.
They answer to one another kind of thing. Yeah.
It's an interesting idea, and I think it made me think of that same thing. It's like maybe the organization comes first through like the military.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about Khrushchev?
I don't mind talking about Khrushchev for a second. The speech he has against Khrushchev is very funny.
Oh, yeah.
Against Khrushchev's phony communism is what he said. I have been reading A Failed Empire by Vladislav Zubak, which is a Soviet perspective of the Cold War history, and I've come to the conclusion, at least a little bit, that Stalin was the last truly ideological leader of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev strikes me as a real big dumbass. He's like a hopeless romantic for communism, where he wants communism in his heart, but he has no clue what that actually means, and he was an idiot. And
he was a revisionist, according to Mao.
Yeah, and I agree, but I don't really know why. That's the thing. I think that he just didn't have an actual image. Also, his foreign policy was very stupid. He was a big part of the kind of brinksmanship that led to crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis,
Mm-hmm.
And I know that on this show, I've been very anti-U.S. in the Cold War. I've been like the U.S. is at fault here, but the Soviet Union were a bunch of fucking idiots too, dude. It's really tough to read, because they've created this organization and it's supposed to filter the best of the top, like it's almost meritocratic in that sense. Like that's the ideal, but Khrushchev had cronies under him essentially. I don't know. I just don't know enough about the structure of the Soviet government to really feel justified or unjustified in my own opinion, because I don't know how he got to that point, but it doesn't seem like a democratic, like a Soviet, like a council in the way that we want it to be.
Mm-hmm.
And that really sucks. Khrushchev was part of a collective group of power that happened after Stalin died. There were three people, Molotov, Khrushchev, and then Mikoyan, I believe. And essentially Khrushchev just positioned himself so that he would be taken as the leader in almost all of the foreign policy debates, and thus essentially assumed the mantle of power, but he had very little experience. I don't really know what that has to do with this. One thing that Mao hates is Khrushchev in here. It's very clear.
Yeah, so in the section cadres, he calls out Khrushchev a few times and stuff that's been quoted here, but in the section cadres, he's talking specifically about trying to make sure that the party and the country, quote, do not change their color.
Yeah.
And in his description of what that means, he calls out Khrushchev as the example not to follow. He says that whether or not the leadership of our party and state will remain in the hands of proletarian revolutionaries, whether or not our descendants will continue to march along the correct road laid down by Marxism-Leninism, or, in other words, whether or not we can successfully prevent the emergence of Khrushchev's revisionism in China, it is an extremely important question. And he says that there are people, quote, like Khrushchev, who wear the cloak of Marxism-Leninism, but don't actually follow its tenets. That we must not be despotic like Khrushchev and violate the party's democratic centralism, make surprise attacks on comrades, or act arbitrarily or dictatorially.
Yeah, because of the fucking secret speech, man. De-Stalinization was the wrong call, even if Stalin was a big fuckhead. That's something that I think is pretty
unequivocal.
Yeah, thank you. Is the fact that when Khrushchev spoke out against Stalin like that, he did irreparable damage to party unity, essentially, even on an ideological level, because I think that there were people that were in favor of reform, and those are the people that de-Stalinization spoke to, but then the actions that Khrushchev took afterwards didn't help those people out at all. There weren't actually any real reforms there. He was an idiot.
Yeah, he seems like a fuck.
He's just a dumbass.
Yeah.
Brezhnev is really funny. I will say that the whole introduction to Brezhnev in the book is scathing. He's like, Brezhnev had no foreign policy experience. He had very little ideological experience. The funniest line is that he said that in order to develop his intellectual capability, Brezhnev kept a diary, a daily journal. But to the dismay of every historian, it is just the day-to-day activities. There's no internal conflict, no thoughts or anything like that. Just like, today I did this. Tomorrow, May 12th. Today I ate chicken. Like, not that obviously, but it's just very funny. And it's like, how did that happen? How did that fucking happen? Stalin's like this giant of history, like a literal great man of history. And what happened? What happened? They were too reliant on the comradely intuition, like as Lenin said, who needs a democracy because the best of the best is up there. They're whatever. I don't know. I guess revisionism. I had nothing to say there. Was there anything that you disagreed with Mao on? Like any strong, you were like, what are you talking about, dude?
Well, I think the only place where that really would have come out for me is in my skepticism of the state.
Yeah.
I think generally speaking, Mao is the only other person that we've read so far other than Lenin that I would say like feels like a real one, where it seems like principled and ideologically consistent.
Yeah.
I don't see any points of like clear contradiction or clear conflict within his ideology and that sort of way. I appreciate his adherence to the mass line, and I recognize that all of his politics seem to come from that. I get the impression that he wasn't much of an economist, but, neither am I. So I don't have any real room to criticize him in that way. But what I do have some discomfort with comes around this idea of the state, the party, and the kind of centralism that he demands around that.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, I have a great deal of skepticism around any sort of possible power being wielded in a way that is so easily corruptible.
Yes.
That is so easily taken advantage of and so easily corrupting in its influence. Where I think there might be people like, I would say Stalin, in my conception of him at this point in my development as a communist anyway, is one of those people that went into a situation as a principled idealist, not idealist in the sense that he saw only good things, but had an ideology that was strong.
Right.
And then fell victim to paranoia, fell victim to playing the game. Once he had a point of an opportunity to have power that he did, he made decisions that were not necessarily in alignment with his ideology because of external influence, right? Yeah. But that's why I'm so skeptical around the idea of putting people in those sorts of positions. And I think Mao's adherence to that centralism, that idea that once the majority has made up their mind, you must follow suit, you must fall in lockstep. Mm-hmm. I have a general discomfort with that, even though I recognize that that's kind of inherent to democracy in general. So I guess that's as far-reaching as my criticisms would really go.
No, I understand. Did we talk about bourgeois individualism this time around?
We haven't talked about it this.
Yeah, because I think that is definitely something we should talk about again, because I feel that that's kind of the issue here. Is that I want people the freedom to act as they want to. Yeah. Part of that comes from what I think is an individualism lent to us by the Western world. Something that Mao talks about here is kind of that liberalism, and he says that a liberal problem is that they want essentially an unjust peace, right? Which we've talked about before, a negative peace. Yeah. And it's that idea of it's that idea of comfort, right? It's this, what Mao says is there are times where we let things slide because we're good friends with a person, or, we hear something that might be wrong, but we don't say it. And Mao rails against that exact thing, and I think that it's kind of part of our conception in the world that we live in. It's this free marketplace of ideas. Everyone can say whatever they want, as wrong as it might be, because that's just the world we live in. And the question I have now is that, is the world we're seeking to construct one that is willing to allow that to happen? Can we have this socialist construction the way we're talking about and still have people that think otherwise, because if the requirement is that everyone follows the party line, are we ever going to be able to do that? That's a challenging question, right? And I think that that's kind of a bit of a root discomfort that I have overall, is the idea that if we need everyone to think alike, then we're never going to fucking do it, Yeah. And that's defeatist. I mean, that's a pessimistic attitude, and I think that it is something that ultimately can be overcome. But
I sure hope so.
Yeah, right. But that's the thing, is that Mao talks about this a lot, where he's saying that there must be struggle, and he understands that it will be a struggle too. He even says in here, we would prefer not to fight a single day. We simply know better, right? Political power comes ultimately from the barrel of a gun. These are all things that Mao's saying because he recognizes that a struggle will be necessary.
Yeah, he says something like, we won't seek it, but we won't shy away from it, something like that.
Right, and I think that that's completely fair, because we need everyone ultimately to be cooperative in order for the society to work, right? And the thing is that the society we build will reinforce those notions by means of its structure. There won't be classes to have conflict, right? There won't be an exploitative minority that has the power to exploit the majority. And those things will reinforce the kind of unity that we're looking for. But until that point, what are we supposed to do is the problem, And I think that maybe even historically, the big issue that the communist states have had is that question there of what do we do with it has been met with exclusion, right? It's been met with dismissal, right? It's been met with purges, and the problem is that I don't know if the alternative, the opposite, the inclusion is possible in the same way. There's a contradiction inherent between the idea of a massive inclusive party and everyone following that party line. How do you square the two,
Yeah.
I just rambled for quite a long time there, but that's kind of where I'm at, is that what do you do with people that don't want to do what you want them to do?
Yeah. Which we have wrestled with in previous episodes talking about that. I think Mao's take, I was trying to find one quote in particular that I wasn't coming back to, but I am struck by his thought about what you're supposed to do with your political enemies in the section Political Work. He's talking about his policy toward prisoners captured from the Japanese. Puppet or anti-communist troops is to set them all free, except for those who have incurred the bitter hatred of the masses and must receive capital punishment, and whose death sentence has been approved by the higher authorities.
God.
That's a pretty big asterisk there. But among the prisoners, those who were coerced into joining the reactionary forces, but who are more or less inclined towards the revolution, should be won over in large numbers to work for our army. The rest should be released, and if they fight us and are captured again, should again be set free.
Yeah.
So, he seems very clearly of the mind that what you do to seek that unity is grant people the opportunity to recognize the rightness of your action and do what you can to try to, educate them appropriately, unless they've done something so egregious to deserve capital punishment, which, again, feels like a pretty big, door that he's left open for himself. But
I mean, it's so strange. It's very strange. Again, it's like the creation of the mass line is something that gives me some discomfort because people that don't agree with the mass line are then excluded.
So I've given this a lot of thought since the whatever episode it was where we were talking about coercion. I feel like it was one of the episodes.
Kropotkin.
Was it
Conquest
Kropotkin?
of Bread? Mm-hmm.
Okay. Because I will still contend that an offer to cooperate is not the same thing as coercion. Mm-hmm. And if someone chooses not to cooperate, that is still a free choice that they are making. It's not coerced.
Yeah.
I think the example we were talking about back then was something like if we say that this is the way this workshop is going to run, it's I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
What do you do? Well, it's the offer is this. Your alternative is to not take the offer. And I do think that there can be something kind of uncomfortable about that, but I think that that's in line with what Mao is saying here, which is give them the opportunity, set them free, give them the opportunity to come back if they so see it. And he says that the idea is that eventually they'll be released enough that there's nothing but a camp of reactionary forces that will have to see the error of their ways over time. And so, I don't know, I'm less uncomfortable with this perceived coercion of the mass line in that, where I have discomfort with it is that, you're supposed to toe the line and not offer dissent other than when it's qualified as the appropriate time and place to do that. And why is that the time that it is qualified is where I find discomfort.
That's kind of where I'm at though, because it's you're with us or against us. That's pretty clear, and there's a lot of opportunities to be with us.
How many opportunities?
Yeah, I guess it's just what do you do with the people that are against you? And the thing is that a liberal maybe struggles with the same question, and their answer is to ignore it. Whereas. This is too general, but a communist has to deal with that problem. Yeah. And that dealing with it is typically the issue that most liberals have with communism, is the fact that it's you've locked up your political prisoners or whatever. It's you gave them the opportunity many, many times to right their wrongs, right? To heal the sickness and save the man. But, after that, they're at the will of the masses. And guess what the masses say? Face the wall. No, I'm just kidding.
I think this is where a state apparatus is necessary. This is where you have to have some sort of mass line because you have to have clear and distinct qualifiers about what is and is not allowed or is not acceptable
behavior. It has to be demarcated.
Yeah, because if it's not, then what you get is
despotism.
Yeah, despotism from a top-down perspective, but also if you try to abstain from any sort of state apparatus whatsoever, what you're going to get is mob justice instead.
The tyranny of structurelessness.
Yes, exactly. And so there has to be some middle ground between the minimum and maximum program.
Trotsky! Yes. Dude, that's a funny realization that I've had to come to, is that we're centrists, Johnson.
I know, right?
We're centrists now. Like, we're just the centrists of the left wing. How fucking funny is that?
Makes me uncomfortable.
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
The problem is that if you don't have some sort of party line, some sort of mass line, then you're going to get a mob that is going to have the face the wall situation.
Yeah.
Like, to pretend as though any state apparatus does not have a mechanism like that is like myopic. You know what I mean? Like the idea that the United States as some sort of supposed free and liberal country doesn't also execute.
Well, yeah. That's the thing, is that like the line is somewhere, you know? Very funny. I don't know. Just when I said the line there, I was like, oh, the mass line, duh. Like, that's what they're talking about. The mass line is literally the line where you can't create that. Like, that's the limit, you know?
Yeah.
It's not that it's like, that's what you have to do. It's like, that's the limit of that's your boundary.
And that comes from the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's a democratic dictatorship.
Yeah. It's kind of like the social contract, you know? It's like, this is what we, the people, agree upon societally. You know, we're just taking that unspoken rule and putting it into the spoken rules. You know, that's what the state is doing. That's what the mass line is doing. And maybe, I had this thought earlier too. Maybe the liberal issue is that they want to break the rules, you know? Is that's like in the liberal conception, is like, the rules are there, but I'm smart enough to know how to break them. Like, that's a feature of our modern society, I feel like. And maybe that kind of discomfort is the idea that everyone is being held accountable to the rules. You know, we in the West have this weird individualist idea that it's like, we're smart enough to kind of shirk the rules of the game here because we know better, right? Because we see the big picture or whatever. We have the esoteric knowledge. But in this ideal society we're talking about, that wiggle room isn't there, you know, and I think that there's a need for that wiggle room inside of the liberal mind. You know, interesting. Yeah, I had that thought earlier because I don't know. It feels like it right now. Even thinking about imperialism, when he says like it's now the genius of financial speculation. You know, it's not about who can actually do it the best. It's about who can really break the rules the best. I don't know. Weird thought. I'll have to think on that one.
You know, what's funny is while we were having this conversation, I did think of another thing that I am a little uncomfortable with, so I maybe disagree with a little bit. Yeah. And it's related to this mass line thing, and that, like, you already made mention of the quote, but the, like, heal the sickness, save the patient, cure the sickness, save the patient thing. My discomfort with that is being an atheist raised as a Baptist, and it sounds too much like love the sinner, hate the sin. Yes. Which makes me very uncomfortable, and I think is, like, ugly at its core. It's a sentiment that I think is inherently not humanist, not a thing that actually sees humanity in individuals. And if I hear that, cure the sickness, save the patient, and I feel very uncomfortable. Yeah. And I think that's related to this whole, like, discomfort with the mass line thing.
I was thinking about love the sinner, hate the sin. It's a line I like to use because it's very funny, you know? It's because it's totally hypocritical, right? Like, the sin and the sinner are interconnected. They're not. It's
also, isn't it a sin to be in judgment, act in judgment upon others?
Who fucking knows, man? I sure don't. But yeah, it's hypocritical. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah. But again, though, when it comes to healing the sickness, saving the man, there's something there that I like. Is that that was a really southern like there. There's something there that I like, and it's the idea that there is a savable man at the end of the day. It's not that, you know, like, ultimately the people we're dealing with are people. You know, they might have some fucked up, sick ideas, but it is possible for those ideas to be healed, you know? And that has its own thing to it. But I think that ultimately, I think it's a good thing to give every person the benefit of the doubt, you know? And that's not the right way to say it, but to understand that at the core is a person that is influenced by their environment, and we ultimately can change that, or they can ultimately change that. It can be changed, passive voice. That's kind of, I like that, you know?
It's funny that you use the passive voice, though, because Mao so clearly says that, like, it's our responsibility to be the ones to do the changing.
Yeah, it is, actually. That's a good point, is that's the struggle, is that we must be the changers. We can't just be content with them being changed. We must be the ones that change them.
And I agree. I do kind of feel like we should just be forthright and say that we talked for 2 hours and then a power surge cut out everything that we were recording.
We had a whole episode. I'm sorry, y'all.
And there was some good stuff in there. This came up previously as well, where I do think that like another thing that might make some of us uncomfortable, particularly those of us that are averse to interpersonal conflict, is this responsibility that Mao says that we carry to be the ones to confront revisionism, confront untruths, whatever you want to say, and like seek to remedy those things, because if we want to see any sort of unity within the party, unity, criticism, unity, if we want to see that unity and bring the party together, it's necessary for us to be the ones to go out and do that. It's not going to happen out of the ether or without any sort of tension.
It won't happen spontaneously.
Yeah, or simply by proclaiming it, right? And so we have a responsibility to do that. And I think that there is something related to what you're saying there, where we have to see that it's important for us to get through to the human and see them as a human and not completely dehumanize our enemies. Because that is a pretty quick way to fall into, purges and all the nasty stuff that comes with despotism. But it's also really difficult, and I think it's justifiable to tell people to go fuck themselves when they're saying shit that merits it. But at the same time, telling them to go fuck themselves isn't going to do anything to bring them on, isn't going to do anything to perpetuate the unity of the party.
Yeah, although I will say something that Mao is against is the that's what tailism is he's saying you can't go and try to push forward all the people at the very end of the line. That's not worth your time. I think what Mao is saying is that it's much more useful. It's a much better use of your energy to go among the middle of the people, to create the mass line, to move the biggest portion of them in the correct direction. And then, what happens with the people at the end, they'll either, join up or go off. They'll go away. And they won't just go away, obviously, but they will be gone. You know what I mean, though? That's the thing, is that, that's that ultimate, that I was going to say coercion. That's that coercive element at the end of the day, is that what happens to that, because there will be a group of people one way or the other, right? That's the thing, is like, it's what do you do with the other people? You know?
There's always going to be some dissent, some dissenter.
Yeah. The liberal lie is that they're still taken care of. We know that that's not the truth in actual society, but it's part of our liberal fantasy that everybody's equal and They just squandered their opportunity or whatever. That's how we rationalize it to ourselves here. Mm-hmm. Whereas in this society we're talking about, it has to be dealt with more directly. And that dealing with it is the problem. You know? Here we can just hand wave it and say, go off and go die. But I guess it's just the willingness to wield power, right? You have to be held accountable for holding accountable. That was a weird way to say that, but there's like, we are taking the ability to hold society accountable. I'm losing the plot here.
I think I'm following what you're saying, and like there has to be accountability. Who watches The Watchmen? To bust out some comic book references, right? But who watches The Watchmen? The people that are the ones holding others accountable also need to be held accountable. Yeah. And Mao is like pretty clear about criticism and self-criticism as being the mechanism by which we do that.
Right.
He even says like dust will accumulate if a room is not cleaned regularly.
Yeah.
So he acknowledges that mistakes will be made,
right,
which literally means people's lives are on the line in this conversation. Yeah. But like, if we have a mechanism in place where we are checking ourselves and make it possible for others to check one another, then ultimately that should happen less and less.
Yeah.
Which is kind of the best we can hope for, I think.
I think I agree. I think that it is the ideal, and I think that in the construction of Chinese socialism, right, the goal is for the mass line, the mass of people to be that check of accountability.
Yeah.
Even if we're elevating this group in the party above the people, they're still being held accountable by the people. It's the same kind of checks and balances that we desire to have in the U.S., right? It's just that it doesn't happen. And likewise, just to give China some discredit, right? It clearly didn't happen in China as well, right? Or at least, they had their own slew of issues with that problem.
Yeah.
Is that the mass ultimately wasn't able to hold the party in check, right? That's what One Dime says in his video, is that the party had become the party was rigid, and Mao wanted to use the people to shake that, because he understood that the power comes from the people. And if the party was just in power without the basis of the people, they would be useless, right? They would be revisionist. They would be of a different color, of a different character. And I think that's exactly the question that we're reckoning with modern China, is whether they're still held accountable to the people,
I don't know.
Yeah, we'll have to find out.
What's interesting, since we're talking about modern China, Mao makes a couple of predictions about China, one of which you already made reference to, but he even specifically calls out China in 2001, just because he's giving like so many years in advance kind of predictions, right? This is at the tail end of section 18, Patriotism and Internationalism. He says, things develop ceaselessly. It is only 45 years since the revolution of 1911, but the face of China has completely changed. In another 45 years, that is in the year 2001, or the beginning of the 21st century, China will have undergone an even greater change. She will have become a powerful socialist industrial country, and that is as it should be. China is a land with an area of 9.6 million square kilometers and a population of 600 million people. She ought to have made a greater contribution to humanity. Her contribution over a long period has been far too small. For this we are regretful, but we must be modest, not only now, but 45 years hence as well.
Yeah.
You should always be modest. I just think I wish I understood modern China better to have a take on that quote, because I wouldn't, in my conception now, say that China is a powerful socialist industrial country, but I can't say why I think that that's true or not.
Yeah, it's interesting because I like that. Upon reflecting upon that quote, I'm much more optimistic about China.
Really,
it's I am more leaning towards like they are socialists. And maybe that's misfounded, but I feel like it's because of exactly what they're saying here. They're taking 600 million people and, statistically, empirically, lifting them out of poverty, right? Like, the world has only been improved because of China, period. I
would agree with that.
That's pretty much it. And it's interesting because the only question on my mind is whether they're socialist or not, and I'm not saying that it just to be helpful to the people is to be socialist, but if we're talking about the standard of living for the people of China, it is only increased because of the government of China, the actions of the Chinese Communist Party.
For sure. For sure.
Yeah. So I think we're just kind of painted in by our Western perspective, but it's going to have to be something we look into for sure.
Yeah.
Is what the hell happened in China? Because it's the only one left. Vietnam and Laos, of course, and Cuba. But, as we said in the Jakarta Method episode, I don't think we wouldn't consider any of these countries to still be like communist countries. They might be like market socialist or whatever. I don't know.
I don't either.
Yeah. Is it even fair to say whether they're socialist or not? How can we judge?
Across generations, through labor and shattered lives, with assist exploitation, just to benefit their bottom line. Endless accumulation.
Very quickly, in the first section, the Communist Party, he has a couple lines that I think are worth talking about. The section begins by saying, if there is to be a revolution, there must be a revolutionary party. Very Leninist. Without a revolutionary party, without a party built on the Marxist-Leninist revolutionary theory and in the Marxist-Leninist revolutionary style, it is impossible to lead the working class and the broad masses of the people in defeating imperialism and its running dogs. So, yes, definitely I see the Lenin in that, and I appreciate it. He goes on in a little later in this section to say, a revolutionary party is carrying out a policy whenever it takes any action. If it is not carrying out a correct policy, it is carrying out a wrong policy. If it is not carrying out a given policy consciously, it is doing so blindly. Okay, and so I think that that's really relevant because I think we have a lot of people that claim to be apolitical or something like that. And the point is that there is always policy, there is always politics. You are choosing to engage with it or not, and your decision is in and of itself a political decision. And so you can choose to participate in the revolution or you can choose not to, but either way, you're making a revolutionary decision.
You know what it reminds me of, honestly, is the fucking anti-racist treadmill, dude. Do you remember that one?
No, what is that?
Oh my God. It's the idea that to be anti-racist, you need to be actively working against racism.
Okay.
It is not enough to simply stand still because the path is always moving backwards. And the metaphor is like the moving walkway at the airport. If you're standing still on it, it's still moving you towards racism. You have to be actively working against it. And it's kind of this, the reason I brought that up is because of what you just said, where it's like you have to your decision to do nothing is a decision ultimately.
Yeah. I'll just continue here because there's one other bit here from this section that I like where he says, if we actually forget the party's general line and general policy, then we shall be blind, half-baked, muddle-headed revolutionaries. And when we carry out a specific line for work and a specific policy, we shall lose our bearings and vacillate now to the left and now to the right, and the work will suffer.
Yeah.
That spoke to something that I think we spent a long time talking about in the last episode, deep within me, which is this, like, where is the point where I know enough to feel confident that we're moving forward in the right direction? Yeah. Because like he says, you are either acting as a revolutionary with a plan, with an idea, or you're acting as a revolutionary without those things. Mm-hmm. And there will be a great difference in the work and a great difference in the outcome based on that. And I don't know, it just spoke to that.
Yeah. Well, what I was thinking of is like beginning with the end in mind, Mm-hmm. It's making me think about the party line, right? It's like to have an idea, to have the line of what your policy is going to be, and then to try to act it out. When you understand whether it's working or not, you change the line. I think it's still possible to get it kind of what the core of what you're saying is, right? Do I know enough to have like an accurate line? I don't think it matters because the line is meant to be changed. It's meant to be worked upon and improved.
Yeah.
So like as much as we're reading is working towards the formation of an initial line, but only when we see that work in practice will we know whether it's adequate or not. And then of course the policy around it is to then change it.
Yeah.
I think that's really what the deal is here. And I actually was thinking about that because I was listening to the last episode, and that question of like, when will I know enough? That's exactly what I had to say. Is like, we're never going to know enough.
Yeah, you never will.
It's just the fact that like our willingness to apply and then to rectify bars. That's the real deal here. Like that's the main thing. Yeah. To do otherwise, right, would be dogmatic. I think that's the core of what Mao is saying here, and I think that's a real strength of what Mao Zedong thought is that he's really talking about that. It's not something that's new, right? Everybody since we read Engels has been saying like to put your ideas into practice and then to understand what works and what doesn't and then to change them. And that's been a line throughout. I think Mao is just doing a really good job of making it clear, to somebody who's like used to studying philosophy or even science, is used to the idea of that scientific process. It's just the fact that process still needs to be applied to our day-to-day practice of life.
Yeah. Well said.
You want to talk about ultra democracy?
Sure.
Oh, actually, so here's the two principles I was trying to find forever ago. Anyone should be allowed to speak out, however he may be, so long as he is not a hostile element and does not make malicious attacks. That's a principle I love already. I'm happy to have a conversation with you as long as I know it's in good faith. Mm-hmm. You can ask as many questions as you want if I know you're not being an asshole about it. I mean, that's just how it feels anyway. Regardless, it doesn't matter if he says something wrong. Leaders at all levels have a duty to listen to others. Two principles must be observed. 1, say all you know and say it without reserve. And 2, don't blame the speaker, but take his words as warning. Unless the principle of don't blame the speaker is observed genuinely and not falsely, the result will not be say all you know and say it without reserve. Sure. I don't know what that last part is there, but
he's saying if you don't accept number 2, you won't get number 1. If you don't accept that people...
Oh, yeah. If you're in the habit of judging people aren't going to say what they really mean.
Exactly.
I love that. See, again, though, it's the problem with, like, this is great in theory. How do we actually implement it? Mm-hmm. Especially when it comes to the politics of people. Like, I would love to think of every party leader as some paragon, some completely non-judgmental, perfectly calculating machine. But I just know that's not the case.
What did you want to say about ultra democracy?
Well, I just think it's interesting the way he talks about ultra democracy. It's not a point of contention. You good?
This is the quote that I was looking for forever.
Yeah, this is the one. This is the one. Because it's where he says that ultra democracy consists in the petty bourgeois' individualistic aversion to discipline. This characteristic is brought into the party. It develops into ultra-democratic ideas politically and organizationally. These ideas are utterly incompatible with the fighting task of the proletariat. So the ultra-democracy part of it was interesting because we've been talking a lot about where are the extents of democracy in the party, right? In our hearts, I think that we both would want it to be as democratic as possible. What both Mao and Lenin at this point have warned against is the kind of ultra-democratic, primitive democracy, that might be your first inclination, If you, like the ultra-egalitarian, are trying to construct a party, your first thought might be everything should be a democratic process. Both Mao and Lenin have warned against that so far, and I'm not exactly sure why.
Well, see, in my conception of ultra democracy here is maybe sounds like a little bit different than yours, because I see it as an antithesis to the democratic centralism that Mao has at the center of his ideology here. The idea of democratic centralism in Mao's conception is that basically you democratically vote on any concept, and then once the majority has reached a decision, everyone falls in line with that decision. What I was taking as ultra democracy in this take is the idea that there is still room and space for that kind of dissenting voice to continue to spread their dissenting ideology, even if it goes against the mass line that has been determined by the majority in a democratic method. And so the ultra democracy, because again, like what can be bad about democracy is, I think, a reasonable question to ask oneself. And we talked last time about expediency as being the problem, which I think is where Lenin's take came from. And certainly what we saw happen in Paris as a part of what was an Achilles heel for the commune there. I wasn't taking Mao's interpretation to be exactly the same. I think it has much more to do with the mass line. Why I think that is in that line that you read there, that quote there on correcting mistaken ideas in the party. Yeah. He says it should be pointed out that the danger of ultra democracy lies in the fact that it damages or even completely wrecks the party organization, that it goes against the mass line and therefore creates dissent and creates division among the party. Yeah. So I see his conception of ultra democracy as being more in line with that. Yeah.
Yeah. I understand what you're saying. I'm just not exactly sure. I don't know. It's weird because it's again, right? The democratic centralism that he's talking about. Maybe I'm just not understanding the difference between democratic centralism and regular democracy. Yeah, and I know that the difference comes in the unity, right? It comes in the actions of the people that were dissenting. Yeah, ultimately, for a group practicing democratic centralism, those people would go back into line. They would then follow the line. But if they can just make their case at the next meeting, then what's the difference between, making your case in the next election or whatever? And it's just the question is like, what happens if they say no? That's really where I'm at. Yeah. What the fuck? Because say you take a vote and then someone votes against it and they're pissy about it. It's like, what do? Do you exclude them from the party? Are they? I don't understand how they're still spreading dissent. I mean, maybe I just don't have a full conception of democratic centralism yet. Do you know what I'm saying, though?
Yeah, I get that, and I think that's a fair question. Hey,
buddy.
Speaking of dissenting voices.
Yeah. This isn't how you do it. Wait for the next meeting.
Depending on how dictatorial the party wants to be, that I think that's the answer to the question. What do you do with those dissenting voices? Yeah. I think Mao's conception is that they would not have space to share that dissent, but what that actually looks like or sounds like is probably some form of exclusion.
Yeah, censorship, coercion, right? Like that's the thing. I don't know. There's a contradiction there. I'm just going to start talking like Mao. There's a contradiction there.
There's an internal contradiction.
Yeah, we have an internal contradiction, as in some people won't shut the fuck up. And if we exclude them, they'll say we're dictators. Well, it's a dictatorship for our enemies and a democracy for our allies.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, but that's the thing. It's like, if you just become an enemy for saying the wrong thing, I don't know, dude. I feel like a fucking Western world fearmonger. Like, if you speak out against the party, they'll simply execute you.
Well, yeah, I mean, Mao's whole thing is that it's a question of discipline. Not that you don't have the freedom to have a dissenting voice, but
that you have the discipline to not speak out.
Yeah, the discipline to maintain the party line even if you do dissent.
Yeah,
I'm not endorsing that idea. I think that that's his rationalization of it.
I feel like it comes with its own problems.
Says it's laissez-faire.
Yeah, I saw that. That's a weird one.
Yeah.
It's a good question. I mean,
something to wrestle with.
Yeah, sure. It is, and unfortunately we're at the length of our, like, how many more socialisms are there to explore? What else is there? That's the problem, is that besides exclusion, what's the alternative? I
think of all of the socialist projects that I am aware of, Mao seems to have the most forgiving attitude toward that dissent, in that it is like, goodbye.
In the book, at least.
Yeah, in the book. Yeah. His attitude is goodbye.
Right.
Here's why you're wrong. Goodbye.
Yeah.
Well, you're welcome to come back if you like, if you've changed your mind.
Yeah.
As opposed to, the more despotic kind of attitude.
Yeah.
But comes at the end of the barrel of a gun, I guess.
Yeah. Well, it's just that ultimately that is the end result, right? Is that it comes down to a use of force. It's that the conflict can't be resolved without force, right? I don't know why, though. I don't even know where I'm at right now. God damn.
Sounds like we need to read some anarchist stuff.
Oh, God.
Something kind of related to that.
Yeah.
Way back when, in the second section, Classes and Class Struggle, I wrote left unity next to this because he's asking who are our enemies, who are our friends.
Yes.
And he says in this, which is very early, this is from 1926.
There you go.
He says, to ensure that we will definitely achieve success in a revolution and will not lead the masses astray, we must pay attention to uniting with our real friends in order to attack our real enemies.
Wow.
To distinguish real friends from real enemies, we must make a general analysis of the economic status of the various classes in Chinese society and of their respective attitudes toward the revolution. And I think that, like, even though he's talking about that a little bit more specifically, I think there is something underlying there about who are our enemies, who are our friends, and what is the appropriate response when we're faced with them.
It's so funny that it's like, our friends are those that are with us. Our enemies are those that are against us.
Yeah.
We should befriend our friends and attack our enemies. Jeez, Mao. Really nice, some real art of war stuff there, where it's like, don't fight in the fog. Well, I do love I actually had the next quote there.
Okay.
Outline where he says, our enemies are all those in league with imperialism, blah, blah, blah. The leading force is the industrial proletariat. Our closest friends are the semi-proletariat and the petty bourgeoisie. As for the vacillating middle bourgeoisie, their right wing may become our enemy, their left wing may become our friend, but we must be constantly on our guard and not let them create confusion within our ranks.
Yep.
So, I mean, it's that same thing. It's like, there is a middle there, but they'll go one way or the other, We just have to be as convincing as possible to everybody we can. And then what do we do with the rest of them? It's the same question. They get the dictatorship, not the democracy. But it's cool because we're the good guy.
I do think that there's something interesting there in that I think, I don't remember where it was exactly, but this is the first text that I've seen approaching the language of morality, where Mao talks about it being specifically moral action, the permissibility of it. He uses some language somewhere. I'm going to sound like an idiot because I don't remember where it was exactly, but that I was like, I found it refreshing because I think like there is a moral implication to all political action, which is obviously why we're wrestling with this question about what do you do with the dissenters, what do you do with the enemies, because we see a morally impermissible action right behind that question, perhaps. But I would argue that like communism or at least egalitarian movements that seek egalitarianism are the political movements that are approaching politics from a moral or ethical standpoint. And I appreciated that Mao was writing about it in that way, at least. Adam Smith is not talking about the morality of capitalism.
Yeah.
And I think that's because it's an inherently immoral or impermissible from a moral standpoint.
We're righteous, man. It feels weird to say that, though. It almost feels like you can't say it. Like you can't
That
be
you're
like
righteous?
Yeah, because I don't know, it's kind of trained into us. It's like that you have to to demonstrate your righteousness. You can't just say it. I don't know what I'm trying to say. It's like we're the righteous force here, but I can't just be like, we're right, you're wrong, fuck off. You know what I mean? I have to demonstrate that in some other way. I don't know.
Well, I mean, the problem is that it's always going to be metaphysical because there is, or at least in history, it has always had to be a metaphysical argument because like the literal physical argument is always dealing with the external forces that are working to undermine what is happening internally within a socialist project. So like you can claim a project to be one that's built on egalitarianism and on uplifting the people, but when there are deliberate forces coming from the outside working to undermine that, you don't have there is no proof in the pudding because it's being undermined. Yeah. So you're still approaching it from a metaphysical perspective, saying like, here we value the people, even though there is a great famine, you know, you know what I mean? Like,
it's like, even though it's like the ideal versus the real, you know, that sucks. That sucks. Boo. I don't remember if we said it in this one or the deleted one, but where Mao says we have to determine whether it's 70% good, 30% bad, or 30% good, 70% bad. Yeah. It's like, I would really just love for that 30% to not be there at all. You know?
Yeah, it would be dope if it was 100%.
Yeah, but we have to acknowledge that 30% because that's where that's where the resolution of the contradictions lies. I mean, we have to deal with that because that was clearly the wrong policy. You know, those gulags or whatever. I don't know.
Well, he does say, we are Marxists, and Marxism teaches that in our approach to a problem, we should start from objective facts, not from abstract definitions, and that we should derive our guiding principles, policies, and measures from an analysis of these facts. Yeah. So this question of idea versus reality, I think, is under that. Yeah. It would be dope if it was like this, but the reality is it's like this, and those are the objective facts from which we have to make our assessment.
The way I marked this is I used 3 colors, right? The green tabs were shit that I agreed with, which there's a bajillion of. The yellow ones were ones I wanted to discuss, not necessarily that I disagreed. And then the red tabs were tabs where I was like, what are you fucking talking about, Mao? And just real quick, I think that Mao speaks very poetically. The first thing I marked, and this was on page 8, so very early on, he says we should support whatever the enemy opposes and oppose whatever the enemy supports. That to me is a lovely bit of chiasmus, but it's a very stupid thing to say. Did we say this in this recording?
I don't remember.
Fuck. It's a very stupid thing to say, you know. Yeah, I don't know. Poetically, that's great, but otherwise, not so much. The only other thing is that, and I can understand why Mao would say this, but he says that the forces of socialism are greater than the forces of imperialism. Obviously fucking not, buddy. You know, because look at where we're at today.
Yeah, it's pretty idealistic.
Yeah, and you know, in addition, like we've been talking about, are they still socialists? Are they still socialists? It's like, yeah, they are, but they've undergone fucking 30 more years of dealing with the West. You know, it's like this is what socialism looks like after all of this fucking struggle.
After all of the half measures.
Yeah, I don't know. Half-baked, right? Just like Mao said.
Muddle-headed?
Yeah. Well, you know, even maybe to flip we didn't talk about paper tigers at all, but they were a real tiger and have now become a bean-curd tiger,
Bean-curd tiger.
Yeah. But it's funny because Mao is using that to describe the West, but I think maybe it is also applicable to China, you know? When in the beginning, they were a real force, a real tiger, and now that they've been affected, so it's not that that's disingenuous a little bit. That's unfair to China, but it's that they have literally changed. You know, they have been changed, right? What came out the other end is not what went in the beginning, you know? And I still think that it's for better, not for worse, but it's not the ideal that we are after, or at least it ain't yet. You know, maybe if they hold out until the rest of the Western world is underwater, then they can finally hit the socialism button. You know, they can pull the big communism lever that they have hidden under Xi Jinping's desk.
You know, some people say global warming is a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese. But I say, show me the receipts. Because why would Xi Jinping want to flood my basement and rust my Bowflex? To what end? To what end?
The only other thing is that I was a little dubious on the section patriotism and internationalism Because Mao says, is it possible to be an internationalist as well as a patriot? We hold that not only can you be, but you also must be. And that's one that's a little weird in my mind. In the context of decolonization, it makes perfect sense because he's talking about the nationalism of oppressed peoples versus the imperial project. So I can understand why Mao is acceptant of national identity in that sense. Okay, however, if we're talking about the global society that we want, is that one in which we have the same countries, but they're all socialist countries? You know, shouldn't we be striving for like a unified globe? I know that sounds ridiculous, but I don't think that the correct conception is just the same map, but everyone's socialist, you know, like all the colors are just different on the map. That one's a little bit odd to me. And again, I know that Mao is speaking pragmatically, you know, in a society that's rapidly dissolving from colonialism, the colonialism of the society is rapidly dissolving.
Yeah.
It's understandable for Mao to say, you know, come together with your people, like your nation, and fight against the imperialist project. But there is an interesting contradiction there that he's saying, like, it's okay to have this specific nationalism, but you also need to be international, you know?
Yeah.
It's like we're creating all of these little socialist bubbles, but they're all supposed to link together. There's something contradictory in there.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with that. And I'm reticent to ever accept any form of nationalism or patriotism as a positive. I understand what you're saying in the context of like a response to colonialism. It makes sense to band together and you could use that. But I agree that like that's a short-sighted view. I think like ultimately our longer view should be an internationalist view, one of like worldwide unity. Yeah.
A great tweet is like, oh, you're a nationalist? Enjoy your imagined community, for mine is all of mankind. You know, it's like, why hem yourself in? You know, this goes into a lot of different things, right? Self-determination, where nations as a whole come from in general. And there's a lot sociologically about what goes into that. But I just think it's interesting that ultimately our conception should be one nation or no nation. You know what I mean? Right? Every border.
No flags, no borders, my man.
Every border implies the violence of its maintenance. Like,
boom.
Yeah. You know, that's real. And it's just, I mean, you know, I know Mao's a big fan of the contradiction here, but there is something contradictory in what he's saying. And that was the only, that's the last red flag I had in here. And it's not even really a red flag because as with much communist thought, in the historical perspective, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah. I will say one closing line.
Yeah.
Before we wrap up with our final thoughts. Mao gives this quote. He says, all men must die, but death can vary in its significance. The ancient Chinese writer Suzuma Xian, said, though death befalls all men alike, it may be weightier than Mount Tai or lighter than a feather. To die for the people is weightier than Mount Tai, but to work for the fascists and die for the exploiters and oppressors is lighter than a feather.
Word.
I appreciate that poeticism that he's carrying, and I really love that metaphor. And we're all going to die.
Sorry to follow a metaphor with a metaphor, but I love when he's talking about the old man in the mountains, right?
Yeah.
There are mountainous. There's a mountain of work to be done, and it is doable, but it's going to take work. It's going to take one step at a time. And if you're not going to do it, then your kids will have to do it, you know. And if they won't do it, then your grandkids will.
Well, and they will continue the work that you have done. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing is that I think it's about the ultimate goal. You know, it's about the creation of socialism. I'm not content with just seizing power and then being stable. I am content to build socialism. I am content for all men to be well taken care of. I am content for each according to his need, from each according to his ability. That's the goal, you know? And I think that, I'm not saying that they just lost sight, but I think maybe they did. This book is inspiring in that sense because he talks a lot about the struggle that it will require. You know, and I think just to give China some credit, I mean, they're still around. For as much shit as I just gave them in this last hour and a half or whatever, in this last episode, they're still kicking. And they're still socialist. Maybe. We'll see. We'll find out.
Yeah. Okay, well, that was Quotations from Chairman Mao Zedong.
What questions did this bring to you, Johnson?
Our conversation around it has me asking a lot of questions about the mass line, really, because I think we were kind of talking before about starting with the end in mind.
Yeah.
And I think understanding what that ends is what helps us in our pursuit to finding it. And I think that that can be construed as a conception of the mass line. You know what you have decided as a people democratically what that ends is going to be. And it's only through strict adherence to that that you're ever going to make it there. Because, as we've seen, through history, as you continue to make concessions or do whatever, move away from it, have a revisionist ideology that moves you ultimately, like this question, is China a socialist country right now? I think it comes from those like slow movements away from that kind of mass line, right? And so it's got me thinking a lot about that, I guess. Not in a clearly tangible way, obviously, but like, what does that look like? What does that mean? And how do we come to that? And how do we stop ourselves from this seemingly natural movement away from it?
Yeah, that was my question too, genuinely, is that, say I'm in line, say I'm here for the party, capital P, I'm in favor of creating the party. How do we ensure that the party is still held accountable to the people? And if that's the mass line, then mechanically speaking, what does that look like? And if it is the Chinese model, how can we ensure that the repercussions of our actions aren't going to be our own downfall, ultimately? Aside from that, is China still socialist? That's a big one, right? How, quote, reformed are they? Maybe we should be saying how revised are they, Yeah. And that's really where I'm at. There's more to read about Mao, for sure. The nicest thing I think about this book is that it maybe gave us some more inclination on what else to read from Mao.
Yeah, the stuff that spoke most clearly to us seemed like good choices to move forward.
Yeah. So
I'm interested to read On Contradiction. I'm interested to read Combat Liberalism.
Combat Liberalism, yeah. Yeah.
Combat Liberalism.
Maybe eventually, maybe we'll have to read Opposed Book Worship. That would be funny, How ironic.
One other question that I'm realizing has come to me through this conversation also is like, we spent a great deal of time asking about dissenters. And I guess the question because I am a person that has a tendency to disengage or not engage in what I see as like dogmatic ideological discourse where people are just further entrenched in their positions and not moving either party in any way. What is my responsibility? Literally, what is my personal responsibility in those sorts of situations? And how do I keep in my own mind this point that we made about how you have to see the humanity behind an ideology, to recognize humans behind their ideology and shift them away from ideology that is obviously anti-revolutionary, hateful, or otherwise bigoted, because my answer up until this point has been abstain. I've become very kind of isolationist in my politics as I've gotten older, where I used to be a very confrontational person. And that didn't do anything for me or the movement that I wasn't aligned to it in any way.
Yeah.
So like, what is my responsibility is a question that I'm thinking about, really.
Yeah. Obviously the kind of confrontation matters. That's really the thing here, is that like the way you deal with that conflict, because it's inevitable, is a significant question. And I think that is also a big question in my mind, is like, what do you do with the dissent? What do you do with the dissent? Right? Because it will happen. And Mao says to be persuasive, to be convincing, what do you do if you can't? I don't know. Like that's just another question in my mind. Was this book worth reading?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm waiting to get to a book where the answer is no, okay? I know they're out there.
We've had some, like, maybe not the first,
I'm waiting for a no.
A hard no?
Fuck no. This shit sucked, bro.
Yeah.
Don't read this. Yeah. Whatever. See, the thing is, like, we're too conscious of what we're reading to pick something that's going to be so fucking terrible.
I suppose that's true. Yeah, definitely it was worth reading. And I will say, like, I was... Maybe surprise is the wrong way to characterize it, but of all the writers that we've read so far, I already had a connection to Kropotkin before we started this podcast. And so, like, I wasn't surprised that I felt connected to Kropotkin.
Yeah.
But even I would say Kropotkin's writing has a tendency to be a little dry sometimes. Reading Lenin for this podcast has been, like, really enlivening. What's the word that I'm looking for? It's like, it really, like, wakes up my spirit. Sparks my spirit, right? And so Lenin has been the real one that we have read so far, and I'm pleasantly surprised to say that Mao is probably the closest that we've come since reading Lenin to having that same sort of spark. I've connected with him in the same sort of way.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree. There are times where I feel that Mao is a little too flowery. That's just my personal
It's just the
take.
English major in me, I guess, that
Yeah,
really
well,
speaks to that.
You know, like I said before, it's like there's times where he's using a rhetorical device, and I don't think it helps his point. It just helps how beautiful it sounds, and that is what it is. You know, that you just got to take it with Mao. Like it's just part of the deal. You know, if you're gonna read Mao, you just have to deal with that. And also, it's fucking translated. I know how hard it is to translate from Chinese, not from personal experience, but just because I'm not stupid. And like, holy shit, man. We're trying to wring out an ideological message from this guy.
Yeah.
I don't think that's impossible, obviously, but...
Yeah, so...
What do you think? Are you an MLM PM Shining Path adherent? How did we do? You can let us know, as well as what else to read, what you've been thinking of, what you're wearing right now, at leftoverredfeedback@gmail.com.
Yes.
Let us know. You can follow us on Twitter if you want. I don't post there. You can follow us on TikTok. I will post there. I love you. Have a great day.
We didn't say what we were reading next.
Shit. So, next time we're going to read...
Reform or Revolution by Rosa Luxemburg.
I'm
looking forward to it.
Yeah, it'll be really nice.
May I request that if you are a listener of the podcast, that you read along with us. I think that this is an interesting kind of, I don't know, the tension's the right word. What's the word I want to say? The idea behind the podcast was that we would have the listeners would be reading along with us.
Yes.
Or at least have exposure to the text that we're talking about. Because our discussion is very clearly not a summary of the reading. I think you as a listener would get more out of it if you have read the text. And so it would be dope
yes,
if you read along with us.
I'm not requesting. You must, right? Elevate yourself, okay? Stop being a part of the 100 fools and step into the circle of 12 wise men.
Follow the party line and read along with us.
Yeah. No, I just think it would be not a fun listen if you're just like, let's see what these two guys are going to ramble on about. No, read it. Just read it. It's online, Marxist.org. Okay, go to the Internet Archive and type in the book. You can read it there. Okay?
Probably also on Socialism for All, I would guess.
Yeah,
right?
I'm not above plugging other podcasts, but I've listened to quite a few of stuff through Socialism for All. Definitely, like, you know.
Go for it.
Shout outs to that guy.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, okay. Was that everything?
I think so. Bye.
Have a great one, y'all. The CIA killed JFK.